Hi, I'm Kai, and welcome back to Expanded Foliage Brushes 2.0. Now, no new brushes this time, but a few pretty big changes. First of all, the model quality issue should be resolved. Everything should look the way it should. And second, the map foliage issue should be resolved as well, depending on your settings. The problem is that new forest brushes cannot be added into the game without some sacrifices, some trade-offs, whichever way you do it. So you need to pick which compromise you're most okay with. As always, the customization is done in the mod folder, in the config file. Now I will upload some preset config files with the mod, so you can pick one of them without having to go through the settings yourself, but you'll have no idea what the presets do, what they enable, and what the drawbacks are, unless you really watch this and take the information in. Also, please let me know which setup you'll be using by the end of this, because I want to make the mod as easy to use as possible. If something doesn't get used at all, then I might remove it, or move it further down in the config file. And if the vast majority of people settle on a similar setup, then I'll just make that the default. So, bear with me, I'll try to get through this as quickly as possible. The main concepts you need to understand are brushes, brush types, we can have either forest brushes or shrub brushes, foliage layers, and layer types. Not all layers are the same. And then once we have all of that, we can get into the real problems that the customization has to handle, which are the null brush and the difference between indexed layers and unindexed layers. Don't worry, it's a lot simpler than it sounds. First of all, brushes are what you see here. The foliage brushes. That's what a brush is. And when you paint with a brush, that spawns certain layers on the map, and those layers have different bits of foliage in them. So for example, this redwoods brush has a redwood trees layer with some trees in it, a redwood saplings layer with saplings and then the sort of dry trees here, a redwood ferns layer, and a redwoods bushes layer at the very bottom here. And then each of these layers can also have multiple brushes that use it. So, for example, this other redwoods brush has the same fern layer and bush layer, but it has a different tree layer and a different sapling layer. The difference there is between the brush type and the layer type, and those really need to be covered at the same time. As I mentioned, there's two different types of brushes. There's the shrub brushes, like these, low down brushes, and stuff that has small trees but not a forest. And then there's forest brushes, which are mainly used for forests. And the layers in this game world are made up of 4 different layer types. You have grass layers, which are these, they spawn the grasses on the map. You have shrub layers, which are used to spawn the shrubs outside forests, and anything inside a shrub brush. There's a forest outskirts layer, as you can see. These sort of saplings, these trees, don't really spawn inside the forest. You can see it even more if I spawn something like this. You can see that the outside is slightly different to the inside. And then we have the forest layer. That's the layer in the center of the forest. Now, shrub brushes spawn both shrub and grass layers evenly throughout them. As you can see, it's a fairly even distribution. And then forest brushes spawn grasses way on the outside, building up into shrubs, building up into forest outskirts, and then building up into a forest in the center. And the other difference, of course, is that forests get a forest texture in the middle, whereas shrubs do not. And because of this build-up and the forest texture, forest brushes generally look better for forests, whereas shrub brushes generally look better for smaller things. Alright, so that's the basics of brushes and layers, and now we can get into the real problems. First of all, these brushes aren't all the brushes that you can see on the map. There is in fact one more hidden brush that you can't paint with, but it is very, very important. And that is the null brush. And you can see it all over here. All the trees that come pre-spawned on a map are spawned using the null brush. So if we want this pre-existing foliage to show up on the map, then we need to attach the null brush to all the grass, shrub, forest and forest outskirts layers that we want to be a part of the map. And so I've done this on every map. I've assigned the null brush to all the modded layers that have the same foliage on them as the vanilla map would have. And that's usually the first brush on every biome, by the way. Usually. And that would be fine, except for a little quirk with how forests work. So right now, I have the game set up to attach the null brush to default tropical grass, shrub, and forest layers in every map. Not the forest outskirts layers, I'll get to that later. And as you can see, the map looks about the same as on vanilla. If we load into a different map, let's say... yeah, that one. I think that one was broken before. You'll see that all the vanilla trees load fine. And if you remember from earlier, the difference between these two brushes was that this was a forest brush and this was a shrub equivalent of the same brush. Now, if I paint the shrub version, it paints just fine. If I delete it, it deletes just fine. Works exactly as you'd expect. But now we get to the forest brush. If I paint it, you'll see some tropical trees are sneaking into the edges. And if I delete it, you'll see that tropical trees are eating into it as I delete it. Now the first issue is pretty easy to solve. That's because I'm building at maximum intensity while holding shift. If I just build normally, the tropical trees do not spawn. But the second issue is way more serious, and that is because for some unknown reason, clearing a forest, like so, spawns that null brush, the same null brush that is used on these trees within the deleted section. Or at least in the blending from the deleted section into the full section. So, rather than just removing the forest itself, it spawns the null brush as part of that removal process, which looks pretty awful. And that is not the case for the shrub brush, which you can just remove as normal. And that's just because the shrub brush is completely independent from other shrub brushes. They don't interact with the null brush or with any other brushes at all. And so, here you can see the first potential trade-off in the config file. The more trees you want to appear in the base map, the more trees will also appear when you delete forests on that map. Now you can technically work with this. You can spawn a forest, start removing it, and then repaint over that to fix it. But it's far from ideal. And this is why I've given you these options in the config file. And by the way, these refer to the biome of the map. So for example, setting this to 3, we'll set it to 3 for all tropical maps, not for tropical brushes. But if you want to keep the forest brushes as forest brushes, that's a hint of what's to come next, you need to decide how much you're willing to sacrifice in terms of vanilla trees. If you set it to 0, then no foliage will spawn on the vanilla maps until you spawn it. If you set it to 1, then only bushes and grasses will spawn. If you set it to 2, then centers of forest will also spawn. And if you set it to 3, then forest outskirts will also spawn. But there's a reason I didn't do that here, and I'll just quickly show you what happens if you do that. So let's save that and restart the game. And by the way, I've loaded into Pennsylvania, so I'm using temperate here. That's because it makes the effect a little bit more noticeable. If you spawn stuff here, you'll see it spawns way more outskirts now. If you delete it, it's way more aggressive with how the outskirts spawn. So, I find 2 to be a pretty good balance. I don't think any of the vanilla trees are actually in the outskirts category, so setting that to 2 is usually fine. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, shrubs and grasses are completely independent from each other. It's just the forests that are affected. So if you set it to 1, that will basically affect no brushes at all. But it will remove all the forests from your maps. And now we can finally get to Biosin, which is just an awful mess of a map. Shame on whoever put it together. You see, even if we set this to 3, which means we're letting the null brush, that's the brush that was used to paint all of this by the developers, we're letting it paint grasses, shrubs, forest, and forest outskirts, it'll still look mostly empty. And that's because, for some reason, Biosin doesn't use even the null brush to spawn its trees. It uses some unnamed brush that we cannot access. And the trees that are normally spawned in it are spawned using unindexed layers. Now, everything we talked about so far have been indexed layers. That means they are layers that spawn specifically when a brush asks them to spawn. That can either be the brushes here, or the null brush, such as this here. So, just as an example, if we spawn this forest, all of the layers attached to this forest are being asked to spawn their foliage. That means the layers are indexed by this brush. And the same is true of the null brush. It has layers attached to it. They are being indexed by the null brush, and the null brush is then spawning these trees. Unindexed layers, however, are not attached to any specific brush. Instead, they spawn anytime you use a brush of their type. So for example, anytime you use a shrub brush like these, all of the unindexed grass and shrub layers enabled on that map will spawn on top of the shrubs you're trying to paint. Likewise, if you try to paint a forest brush, then all of the unindexed grass, shrub, forest, and forest outskirts layers enabled on that map will spawn on top of the trees you're actually trying to paint. So, as a good example of that, let's open the mod and just disable it for now. That is how Biosin is set up. So all of these trees are invisible because they weren't painted with a null brush. They were instead painted using some unnamed, unnumbered forest brush and rely on unindexed forest layers to spawn both over the null brush that was used to paint this map and the vanilla forest that you spawn when painting. So these trees don't actually exist within this brush. They're not layers attached to this brush. Instead, the brush is empty and it spawns the vanilla trees that come with the map. So, if we now enable the mod again, and then go down here, this is the setting that tells the mod whether or not to clear out the unindexed layers. And we say, no, let them spawn normally on Biosin. And now we restart the game. Then you'll see that now, thanks to the unindexed layers, the trees spawn normally as they should on the map. But if we try to paint a different forest, like say this one, as I said, these trees will spawn over every single forest. Try to use these trees here. They spawn over those trees as well, at the same intensity as the forest that you're painting. And just for one more example, let's use Malta. So you get the Malta trees, but also you get the regular Biosin forest spawning over them. In the kindest way possible, this map was designed by a moron. But that's neither here nor there. So, looking at this, you can probably imagine why the mod removes unindexed layers by default. And as I mentioned, this setting here, or rather the settings, one per biome, tell the mod whether or not to clear out any unindexed layers on a map or leave them as they are. The benefit of leaving them as they are is the map will look completely normal. The downside is all of the forest will be completely unusable. So, for most biomes, that is for most maps, I would leave this as true, so clear out the unindexed layers to not ruin the mod, and use this to customize how many trees spawn. But for Biosin, I would leave this as false, just so that you can get your regular looking forest. So does that mean that there is no way to play on a forested Biosin map with functional expanded brushes? Not quite. You see, the mod can still remove all of the unindexed shrub and grass layers, and the map will look fine. In fact, I've done that just here. If I zoom in, you'll see the grass is still visible, the shrubs are still visible if I paint some more shrubs. If I can find Biosin, there we go. They all look perfectly fine, even though I have removed all of the unindexed shrub and grass layers. Because, just like with deleting forests, it's only the forest brushes that are the problem. The shrub brushes are perfectly fine. If I paint this, you'll see it's painted standalone, and it looks fine. If I paint the forest brush, that's the one that's having issues. So, the one last trick the mod can pull is to set all of the forest brushes used on any one biome's map to act as shrub brushes instead. And that's exactly what this setting here does. It lets you turn all of the forest brushes on the maps within that biome to act as shrub brushes instead. So, if we set this to true for Biosin, as an example, and reload the game. So here we are back in Biosin. Again, all of the trees are spawning as normal, because we are not clearing out the Biosin unindexed layers. And now, if we start painting, say, these trees here, you'll see they're not being filled in with these trees. That's because they are now being treated as a shrub brush and not as a forest brush. They still provide forest, but they're not being treated as a forest brush. But there are trade-offs. Don't mind me switching maps. There's a few sound effects on the Biosin map that are fucking obnoxious to record with. You'll also notice that some of the trees aren't spawning beyond the map's borders. That's not this setting, that's something else I was playing around with and I forgot to turn off for the recording. First of all, as you can see, there is no more build-up from the outside into the center of the forest. That's true for every brush on this map now. Again, I've set this to true for tropical as well, just to demonstrate. If you paint this, there is no build-up from grass to shrub to outskirts to center of forest. It's all just center of forest. The other issue is that as you spawn trees, you'll see they spawn all the way up to the edge of your cursor, which just isn't nearly as impressive looking. Looks a little bit awkward, doesn't it? But this can be fixed with a little patching, by just using some regular shrubs outside the forest, just sort of add that little bit of blending. And the third issue, this seems to be a little bit more choppy than using forest brushes as they are intended to be used. But that's mainly because of how I set the mod up, just to allow for this level of customization. And finally, using this, we don't get any forest ground texture, which can be fine, but in other situations like this, it could just look a little off. This redwoods brush in particular has no grass because it was designed with a dirt texture in mind, like a realistic forest should look. But now it has this weird flat grass texture and it looks a little bit off. Same thing is true with, I believe, these jungles here. If you look into them, they're a little bit weird looking because they have no grass and no dirt. So, that's 3 ways to customize brushes, along with a few different trade-offs for each method. I figure different people will have different preferences over how the mod should handle this kind of stuff, and it was a real pain to set it up this way, but it's done now, and you have the customizability. And there you have it. You graduated Brush College. You now understand all of the issues and trade-offs between the different config options. As I said, I'll package some preset config files when I update the mod, and they'll be in the same zip file that you download, but you now know what they do. And of course, you can ignore them completely and just use the config file to customize the mod as you see fit. And again, please let me know which settings you'll be using and if they're different between the maps. I need that to decide what the default settings should be and which settings may not be getting any use at all. And the update should be out pretty soon.